Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to On Course with Liberal Arts. Today's topic is Elections 2020. What's likely to happen and what does it mean? It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean Theriault. Dr. Theriault is an author and professor in the College of Liberal Arts Department of Government. His classes include the U.S. Congress, congressional elections, party polarization in the United States, and the politics of the Catholic Church. He's received numerous teaching awards, including the Friar Society Teaching Fellowship, UT Professor of the Year, and the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, and is a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers. Please send your questions via the chat function, and we will answer as many as possible after the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Theriault.
Great, thanks so much for that nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. And I want to thank the College of Liberal Arts for inviting me to come and give this talk. And I want to thank all of you for signing in. I feel like at this point, a week out from the election, you probably have had your full of the election. And so I'm just thrilled that you were able to join us this afternoon. I thought before I would get started, I would just give you a little bit of an insight in what teaching is like these days. Right during the whole COVID crisis, our normal classroom isn't quite the same as it used to be. So this is what the classroom looks like for those of us that are lucky enough to be inside of a classroom. While most in-person classes at UT no longer are functioning, there are lots of remote studios that they've set up that have good cameras and good lighting, and you can see that blue backdrop. And so I'm teaching a 250-person congressional elections class, upper division, and this is what it looks like. And it also looks like this for a class that I'm co-teaching with Bethany Albertson on Elections 2020 that has over 1,200 students enrolled. But for another class of mine, it looks not unlike, I'm sure, a lot of the meetings that you all are enduring these days in a COVID world. But I like to think that on the 40 acres and UT generally, and one of my personal philosophies is that I like to try and make lemonade out of lemons. So when COVID hit, I had previously taught at Sciences Po Lyon. And so with my host, when I was at Sciences Po Lyon, we decided to invent a new course. And this is what you're seeing this photo of in part. So we're teaching a politics of COVID class that contains 25 students from UT and then 25 students from Sciences Po Lyon. And what's been great about that class is that we never would have done it, except we were already going to be teaching on Zoom anyway. In the situations in France and the United States have been different. So there have been times where the French students have been teaching us about what it's like. And then there are other times where we have been teaching the French students what it's like with COVID. And it's just been a wonderful experience for me teaching the class, and I hope for the students. Of course, we're wrestling with some really scholarly and academic material, but it's also giving us kind of the space to deal with an entirely new situation. And so it's been a thrill for me. And I should say that COVID has led to other enhancements, I think, in the teaching experience. In the class that Bethany and I are co-teaching on Elections 2020, and then my upper division class on congressional elections, we've been lucky enough to have lots of congressional candidates come through, including Wendy Davis. And so we were able to have Wendy Davis come to class, and I should say come to class. And it's been great. And so the students were able to ask her questions, and she answered them. And it's been a great exchange. We've had 3 congressional candidates into our classes so far. So while teaching hasn't been as great as it normally is, I love the interpersonal interactions with the students. I love the interplay that we can experience inside the classroom. But given the crazy world in which we're living these days, I wanted you all to know that we're trying to make the best of it. And in some of the ways that I think that we're making the best of it are actually improving the education. And before I get started, I know that there are some folks here who have been great and generous supporters to UT, and I want to personally thank you for the experiences that you're giving not only me, but my students. I like to expand the classroom, and so sometimes that includes taking students to DC, sometimes it includes teaching a class in Rome on the politics of the Catholic Church. And while those opportunities might be available for my students who have the means to afford them, what your generosity does is it provides the means for students it provides the avenue for students who don't have the means to do those programs. And so I'm just so grateful for the investment that you make not only in UT, but primarily for my students, so that I can open the classroom door to them, whether it's in DC or whether it's in Rome or wherever it is. And we couldn't do it without you. So thanks so much for that. Now to the talk. We're going to do a deep dive into the elections. Unfortunately for you, I'm going to make you endure Article 1. For those of you who are attending, who are former students of mine, you know how important I think Article 1 is. And so it's all about Congress. So I'm going to make you endure some congressional election predictions before we get to the reason I suspect that many of you are here, which is, of course, Article 2 in the presidential election. And I'll end today's talk by talking about how certain we should be feeling about the data that I'm going to be presenting to you over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. Let's start where the framers of the Constitution started, with the House of Representatives. So, of course, there are 435 members in the House of Representatives, and so either party needs 218 seats in order to be a majority party. If we classify all 435 congressional districts into how safe they are for either party, if we start at the safest level, right, what we call solid Democrat or Republican seats, we start off with 191 seats going to the Democrats, including Sheila Jackson Lee, whose photo is there, representing, of course, Houston. And then there are 153 solid Republican seats. And the photo that I have there is of Lance Gooden. He represents Kaufman County up by Tyler. And the reason I include Lance is because he's a former student of mine who is now serving in his first term in the U.S. House of Representatives. So he is a solid Republican win a week from now, according to the experts. And I should let you know that the data, at least for this part of the talk that I'm presenting, is from the Cook Political Report, which I think is the best. And the reason I like Cook Political Report is because they're not likely to call seats in one direction or the other unless they're pretty certain. So their default is toss up. And then if they have some evidence that suggests it should go in one direction or the other, they'll put it there. And so I feel pretty confident that there's 191 Democrats in the next House of Representatives, and there's 153 Republicans in the next U.S. House of Representatives. If we next look at the likely categories, then we're going to add Lizzie Purnell Fletcher, who represents Houston, and Colin Allred. Both of them are in their first term in the U.S. House of Representatives, having flipped Republican seats in 2018. And right now, with the two of them and 16 others, we think are likely Democratic seats. There are 4 seats in Republican hands that we think are also likely. Those include Ron White from Arlington, John Carter from the suburbs of Houston up towards Round Rock, Roger Williams, whose district goes all the way from Fort Worth all the way down into Austin suburbs, and then Dan Crenshaw, who represents part of Houston and then some of the outlying area. And the 4 of them, plus 9 of their others, we call likely Republicans, which means the Republicans in the solid and likely have 166 seats, which puts them 43 seats behind the Democrats in just looking at the solid and likely categories. Let me throw in the leaning categories. There's one poor guy over on the left-hand side. So that's Will Hurd, a Republican. And the reason that his photo is upside down is because we think that Republican seat is leaning towards the Democrats at this stage in the campaign. And the reason that his photo is a little bit faded is because he's retired. And so he's retiring at the end of this Congress, and so it's an open seat. And we think right now it's leaning towards the Democrats. The Republicans have 15 leaning Republican seats, including Mike McCall, whose district goes from Austin to Houston, and then Van Taylor, who represents Dallas suburbs, Plano. And that gives us the 26 toss-up races, which includes Chip Roy, again, another Austin-based district that extends down towards San Antonio. And it also includes Kenny Merchant, who's retiring, and Pete Olson's district. So Kenny's district is up in the Dallas suburbs, and then Pete Olson's district is down in Fort Bend County, so Houston suburbs. So 20 toss-up races, 26 toss-ups. Which means even if the Republicans win every single seat right now that we think is a toss-up, that only brings them to 207 of the seats that they would need. So they would still need 11 seats. So they could start leaning, right? They might be able to pick off some of those leaning Democratic seats. But again, like 11, that's highly unlikely, especially when we look at the track record of Cook Political Report over time. So we go back to 2018, a really unusual election because of the high turnout, right? They were only wrong in seats that they were saying were either leaning or likely in 3 instances, right? They underestimated Democratic support, and they were often 3, 1 likely Republican and 2 leaning Republicans. And then if we look at the track record across time, they usually perform pretty strongly, such that their record is really good. And so, right, like even if you include the last 12 years in data, it's really hard to come up with that they would be wrong on 11 leaning seats, which means that at this point, we're pretty certain that the Democrats are going to control the U.S. House of Representatives that starts meeting in early January. Let's look at the second chamber. So we'll look at the Senate, and of course, in the Senate, you need you need 50 seats. And so there are a bunch of Senate seats that aren't up. 35 Democrats aren't up, including Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. And there are 30 Republicans who aren't up, including our very own Ted Cruz here in Texas, and then the senator from Nebraska. And right now there are 10 Democrats that we think are in solid position to win the election next week. And there are 10 Republicans that we think are also in a pretty solid position to win their election next week. So when we add the likely seats, we get no additional Democrats. And there's only one Republican. I suspect that that's a Republican that many of you recognize. Of course, that's the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. Looking at the leaning seats right now, so you'll notice that there are two over on the left-hand side that are upside down again. You know, of course, that means that's flipping those seats. And so the two seats that we think right now are going to flip from Republican to Democrat are Cory Gardner on Colorado and Martha McSally in Arizona. And then the other leaning Democratic seat is Gary Peters in Michigan. Of course, I'm from Michigan. And I was lucky enough to meet Gary at some point, and he was gracious enough to hold a copy of my book. And so that's a photo of the two of us in my book. There are 4 leaning Republican seats right now. So up in Alaska, Dan Sullivan, he's up in the upper right-hand corner. John Cornyn in Texas is right now leaning towards the Republicans, and then the open seat in Kansas. And then you'll notice poor Doug Jones is upside down. That's a Democratic senator representing Alabama. We think at this point right now that seat is leaning towards the Republicans. So before we get to the toss-ups, you see that neither party passes that black bar at the bottom of the chart, which means that the 7 toss-up seats are ultimately going to determine which party controls the next Senate that meets in early January. What's interesting is all 7 of the toss-up seats involve incumbent Republicans. So we have Tom Tillis from North Carolina. We have the appointed senator from Georgia, Kelly Loeffler, and then another senator from Georgia, Senator Perdue. We have Joni Ernst from Iowa, Susan Collins from Maine, Steve Dines from Montana, and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. We think are all toss-ups right now. That's a dangerous place for incumbents to be at this point. What we know generally is that in the last week of the election, it's rare that the incumbent, that the undecided voters break disproportionately towards the incumbent. And so I think that from them, we will definitely see some of them losing on election night. Let's do a deeper dive into some of those more competitive seats. So if we take away the solid and the senators who aren't up, that gives us 45 Democrats. If we take up the solid Republicans and those Republicans not up for election this cycle, that gives us 40 Republicans. When we add those, we're pretty certain what's going to happen at the results. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about what these numbers are. So you'll see Gardner. Cory Gardner's name is crossed out. That means that we think at this point he's likely to lose. Right now, the Democrats have a poll advantage of 8.5. The brackets mean that there aren't too many polls in the state, so we're a little bit uncertain about that. And the odds, according to The Economist and according to 538, are that Cory Gardner is going to lose, right? So the John Hickenlooper, the Democrat, the odds of him winning are 95%, according to The Economist, and 84%. According to 538, which means that of all of the other seats in play, Cory Gardner's is the next most likely to fall to the Democrats. Then we have Gary Peters, right? And you see that his 6 percentage point polling advantage doesn't have the brackets, which means that we have more polling in Michigan at this point. And so we're more certain that 6% is approximately where that race is right now. And then we see Martha McSally losing. At the bottom, we see Mitch McConnell and Doug Jones losing his seat. And then you see John Cornyn there right now, who has about an 3% advantage in the polls, right? The Democratic advantage is minus, which means that John Cornyn is up by 8.3%. The experts are saying that he has about a 85 to 90% chance, at this point at least, of pulling that race out. When we get even to the closer races, we see that we have a few more Republicans who are at this point projected to lose, including Tom Tillis and Susan Collins and Joni Ernst. And in fact, if Joni Ernst loses, that's the 51st seat for the Democrats. So right now, Teresa Greenfield, who's the Democrat in that race, has about a 2-point poll advantage. And experts think that she has about a 60% chance of holding on to, of knocking off Joni Ernst. But those 2 seats there in the middle, those are the most interesting, right? So they're Georgia, right? So Kelly Loeffler's race currently has 13 people running in. It's a jungle primary because it is to finish the vacancy created by Johnny Isakson's retirement. And so the top 2 vote getters in this, if no one breaks 50%, are then going to have to compete in January. And I think it's highly unlikely that anyone is going to top 50%, which means that at this point, it looks like it's going to be Warnock, the Democrat, is going to be battling either the current ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Collins, or Kelly Loeffler, who's the incumbent who was appointed to that seat. And so I think that race is going to go on. And so if one of those races at the top of the graph end up being wrong, then it means we have a 50-50 Senate, 49-40, 50 Senate, something like that. I think if the experts are wrong in their calls of anything right now, it's in the certainty with which they think the Democrats are going to control the new Senate. I think that at this point, it's at best a coin flip for the Democrats. I think it depends a lot on how these races break. I can't imagine that Joni Ernst or Senator Perdue are going to lose in Iowa and Georgia if Trump ends up pulling out Iowa and Georgia, right? Steve Daines, right? If Trump ends up winning Montana by a handful of points, there's no way that Steve Daines is going to lose. Same is true with Lindsey Graham. So a lot of those races are going to depend upon a whole lot what happens at the presidential level. To look and see, right, this is my first rodeo. So I have some of the charts from previous elections. So this is the 2018 race. So the ones in yellow circles means that the experts were wrong. But you know what, at the point at which the experts are saying there's a 70% chance of something happening, that's pretty much a coin flip. I think anything between 30 and 50, 30 and 70 is really a coin flip. It's when we get outside of the bounds of the 70 that we begin to speak with a bit more certainty about what's going to happen with those races. Going back to 2016, they were wrong about 2 races. Going back to 2014, they were wrong about 2 races. 2012, they were only wrong about 1 race, right? The Heidi Heitkamp race. In 2010, they were wrong in 3 races. But again, these were such small margins that it's really hard to call them wrong. 2008, they were wrong in 1 race, just the Norm Coleman, Al Franken race, where Al Franken ended up defeating Norm Coleman. So generally, the experts are wrong on maybe 2 or 3 races in any given cycle. And so again, if we think that the Democrats right now, if everything breaks the way that the experts think right now, 52-48, if they're wrong on 2 of those races, we're looking at a 50-50 Senate. So again, I'm highly suspicious that the Democrats are in a commanding position right now, at least with respect to the Senate. Let's do a deep dive now into Article 2, right, the presidency. And we'll start off with some general numbers looking at polling for the nation, and then we'll do a deeper dive into the states. So at this point, do you approve or disapprove of the way that President Trump is handling his job? Right, so right now, disapproval is 53% and approval is 44%. What you're going to notice throughout much of the next 20 minutes of this presentation, you're going to see 42, 43, 44%, an awful lot when it comes to talking about Donald Trump. Right, so approval at this point in the presidency, it's important because it tells us a whole lot about what's likely to happen on Election Day. So if we look back at presidential approval over time, with respect to, let's just start with Barack Obama, his net approval on the day that he was elected was about 55%. So we could think of that as 75% of Americans were approving of him, and maybe 20% were disapproving, so 75 minus 20 equals 55, not approval. And then, right, the presidents start making decisions and they start having to react to events, and they lose some support of the American public. So we see Barack Obama bottoms out about 8 months, 9 months before the election. But then as it becomes clear that he's running against Mitt Romney, really anyone who gets named at that point, he starts ticking back up in the polls and he ends up winning re-election. Same is true with George W. Bush, although he starts a little bit lower, goes up much higher because of September 11th, but ends up in exactly the same place as Barack Obama. Of course, both of them were re-elected. Bill Clinton goes down further than Barack Obama did earlier, but comes up higher in time for his re-election in 1996. George H.W. Bush experiences that big Bush rally a year or so after his son, relative in the presidency, but then suffers the economic decline that we experienced in the early 1990s and ends up below that zero mark on the day of his re-election. Ronald Reagan is even more popular than Bill Clinton on the day that he's re-elected, and Jimmy Carter is even less popular than George H.W. Bush on the day that he is defeated for the presidency. So the black line is the average of those presidencies over time. And now we look at where Donald Trump's number is, right? The difference between what you see with Obama and the previous presidents relative to President Trump is that there all is huge variance in how the American public was thinking of the president at the various stages of their first term. With Donald Trump, there hasn't been hardly any variance. Again, we're talking about a presidency that has been right around 42, 43% for the entire 4 years. To give you a bigger indication of the variance in presidential approval across time, so Barack Obama was as high as 56% and as low as minus 10%. That black bar in the middle is where he is at break-even point, where net approval is zero, which means just as many people are approving of the president as disapproving the president. That's the total range. If we just isolate it to one standard deviation, we see that the range is a good bit smaller for Barack Obama. And here's the ranges, both total ranges and then the standard deviation changes for the other presidents. And we can compare that with Donald Trump. Look at how much smaller the variance is with Donald Trump. His supporters are definitely his supporters, and there's nothing that he can do that would make him not support him. But his opponents are his opponents. And I suspect that there's nothing that Donald Trump could do to get his opponents to support him. Again, we're dealing with a presidency of 42, 43%, almost the entire 4 years that he has been president. The importance of all of this, of course, is its relationship to re-election. So any of the presidents that had net approval that was in positive territory were re-elected. Any president that was in negative approval was not re-elected. So right now, Donald Trump is at minus 6%. So if passed as prologue, that would suggest that he's in some danger as we go forward. A little bit deeper dive, more specifically to the election. If the election were held today, who would you support? So this is Real Clear Politics as of last night when I was updating the slides. Joe Biden has 51%, and we see Donald Trump at that famous 43% for Donald Trump. So we think that Joe Biden is ahead by about 8 points. Another remarkable thing about the 2020 race is the amazing stability in it. So if we go back to the conventions, this is where the numbers have been, right? So we see that Donald Trump has always been somewhere between 40 and 44% the entire campaign. Joe Biden has always been between 48 and 52%. Again, the entire campaign. So even though we've had huge spikes in COVID, even though the president himself has contracted COVID, even though we had the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, even though we had a Democratic convention, a Republican convention, one extremely disappointing debate and one recuperated debate, shall we say, right, the numbers haven't changed. So we know that Donald Trump's support is somewhere between 40 and 44%. But of course, all of you know who are signing up for a talk about the elections a week ahead of time know that it's not a national vote that determines who our next president is. Rather, it's the separate vote of 50 separate states, the District of Columbia. And I should say further that those 50 separate votes of those states are done at the city and county level. And so they're really done at the local level. And so Harris County has a great deal of control over the way that it runs its election, and it can deviate in some really important ways to the way that we do it here in Travis County. And the way that Texas does it, of course, is different than the way that Pennsylvania and Michigan does it. I suspect that in the days after the election, we're all going to become experts in exactly how the votes are counted, when they're counted, and the certainty with which we feel the current totals are of each of the individual states at any particular moment in time. So a deeper dive into the Electoral College. Right now, we think that Joe Biden is solid with 188 Electoral College votes. The one interesting one that I will point out there is you'll notice that Maine 1 is worth 1 Electoral College vote. So remember that Maine and Nebraska give the winner of the state the 2 Electoral College votes associated with the Senate. And then they look at whoever wins in each of the 2 congressional districts in Maine or the 3 congressional districts in Nebraska, and whoever wins within each of those congressional districts then picks up an Electoral College vote. So right now we think that the Maine's 1st congressional district is pretty Democratic, and so we think that Joe Biden is going to certainly pick up 1 out of the 4 votes of the Electoral College votes in Maine. We see that Donald Trump has 77 Electoral College votes when we look at his solid states. Adding in the likely Biden states, we get Maine's 2 votes associated with the Senate, as well as Colorado and Virginia. And Trump picks up 7 more states, giving him 48 likely Trump Electoral College votes. When we throw in the leaners, we'll see here that Joe Biden picks up another 8 states or so, including Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. That's the district right around Omaha. You see that Arizona is in a bluish tinge. That means that since I started teaching class, Arizona is trending in a Democratic direction, such that it's now leaning. It used to be toss-up. We see that Nevada is in a red color. It's leaning to Biden, but it used to be likely to Biden. And so we see Nevada trending in the opposite direction from Arizona. And then, right, a surprise, I think, to anyone at the beginning of this cycle, that at this point, a week out, that Texas would be a leaning Trump state. It's the only leaning Trump state at this point with its huge 38 Electoral College votes, which means that we have the toss-ups, right, of Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Maine's other congressional district, North Carolina, and Ohio, right, those 85 toss-ups. So let's do a deeper dive into what the polling shows us in some of those toss-up and leaning states. So if we if we take away the safe Electoral College votes to Biden, we're at that 188 that was on the previous slide. And if we look at the safe Electoral College votes to Trump, we're at the 77 votes. Those states that right now we think that one of the candidates has more than a 90% chance of winning: Virginia, Maine, Colorado, New Hampshire, Michigan. And then, of course, we have Missouri, Kansas, Indiana, and Utah for the Republicans. Those states that are a little bit closer, where 80% or so, we're 80% certain that they're going to tilt in one direction or the other. We'll see with the addition of Pennsylvania there, right? Pennsylvania takes Joe Biden's total to 272. Joe Biden only needs 270. And so right now we would call Pennsylvania the flipping point state. So if Joe Biden does at least as well in Pennsylvania as he's doing now, he's up by 5.6 points in the polls, and he wins all those other states ahead of Pennsylvania, then he wins the presidency, right? I would caution you that 3 out of the 4 states, including Pennsylvania, that are ahead of it, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That was supposed to be Hillary Clinton's blue wall, right? That was the reason that Hillary Clinton was supposed to be elected president in 2016. So, right, there's a little bit of irony that at this point, it appears as though they are Joe Biden's blue wall. But, right, Joe Biden doesn't need Nevada, but he's up by about 5 points right now in the polls. Doing a closer look at some of those last few states, right, so Florida right now, Biden has a 1.4 advantage. The experts think he has about a 70% chance of winning, right? You'll see Texas there, right, where Donald Trump has about a 4-point advantage in the polls. And experts think that he has about a 70% chance of winning in Texas. So right now, it appears as though Texas is as likely to go to the Republicans as Florida is to go to the Democrats. Now think about that for a minute, because that'll give you a little bit of an indication, at least, of what the polling is telling us at this point in the race. So if you think there's no chance that Joe Biden is ever going to win Texas, then you got to feel pretty certain that Joe Biden's going to win Florida. But if you think that there's some chance you could imagine Biden winning Texas, then you think, oh, well, there's equally good chance that Donald Trump is going to win Florida. And if he wins Florida and Nevada and then picks off Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, he's president again. So, right, that's one of the ways that we can look at all of this. And then those very closest states, right? North Carolina, our difference is 1.2 points. Arizona, 2.4 points. Iowa, right now, where Joe Biden has a lead of less than a point. And then Georgia, where he's down by less than a point. That's where the race stands. There's two key demographics that I'm looking at right now. And these are lessons that we learned in the 2018 election. The first one of those is women, right? We know that the gender gap exists in American politics and that it's growing. So if you go back to 1992, the gender gap, the difference between how women voted for Democrats and men voted for Democrats was only 6 points. But over time, we see that gap has grown more and more. And the reason that gap is so important is because women are voting disproportionately for Democratic candidates these days, and they're a larger share of the electorate. So if we combine both of those things, we can get a sense of how much gender plays into which side ultimately wins. If we go back to the 2012 election, an election that was pretty good for Democrats, Barack Obama was reelected president, the women pulled the national average 6 points towards the Democratic Party. And that was balanced off by men, which were pulling the national vote towards the Republicans by about 3.3 percentage points. If we go to 2014, a good year for Republicans, we see that the men were pulling it almost 8 points. Women were pulling it in the opposite direction, only 2 points. And that's the reason Republicans did really well. 2016, we think of as being a very close election. And we see that their effects were counterbalanced, right? So women were pulling it almost as much as men were pulling it towards the Republicans. And then look at 2018, right? Women were pulling the national vote 10 points in the Democrats' direction. And that was offset by only 2-point advantage to the Republicans because of the men. The other big demographic we're looking at is young voters, right? So young voters make up 22% of the population. However, in the 2018 election, they were only 13% of the voters. And we see that they gave their voice by lack of voting to people who are 65 years and older. And the reason that that matters is because young voters vote disproportionately for the Democratic Party. As high as 17 points in 1972, they were all over George McGovern. Or maybe the real case there was that rest of the voters were not into George McGovern. And so it made it look like the youth were really into him. 2018, the gap was 14 points. Right now, the gap, according to lots of polling, is about 17 points. So if that gap persists, and if young people vote, that has a huge effect on what ultimately is going to happen on election day. Doing the same sort of analysis that we did for gender, but only for age, we see the youngest voters in 2012 were pulling the national vote towards the Democrats by 4 points. The next age group was pulling at 2 points. And then the older folks were pulling at 2 points each in the opposite direction. 2014, a good year for Republicans. And we see that the voice of the youth was relatively muted because they weren't voting as disproportionately for Democrats, and they weren't participating in the election as their proportions might suggest. 2016, again, that tied election. And then the big effect from 2018 for the youth voting at really high rates. So I'm going to end today's talk by posing a question. So the question I'm going to pose is, will Trump really lose this election? I'm going to provide you with a narrative that says, yes, he most certainly is going to lose. And then I'm going to provide you with a narrative that says, no, he's not going to lose. And you should evaluate which one of these narratives you think is more telling or more accurate. And that becomes your talking point over the course of the next week when you're talking with your friends about who you think is likely to win this election. So if you think Trump is really going to lose, here are the things that you're going to point to. The first thing you're going to say, the polls. The polls show that he's going to lose. So let's do a little bit deeper dive into exactly what the polls are saying. So I'm going to do this, and I don't know if this chart is too complicated. We're going to look at all the states where the polling advantage is somewhere towards 10 points up for the Democrats, which is at the top of the chart, or 10 points towards the Republicans, which is down at the bottom of the chart. And so we have a state there, I can't remember what state that is, where Joe Biden has about a 10-point advantage in the polls. And the size of the dot is indicative of the number of Electoral College votes that state provides. So, right, that 8 points, that might be, so it's 3. So maybe Montana for the Republicans, and maybe that's Minnesota or something like that. That's around 9 points for the Democrats. And here are the rest of the states and where they're filling in. right? You'll see that line through the zero, right? So remember how close right now Georgia and Ohio and Iowa are. They're all close to that zero mark. So again, the flipping point state is Pennsylvania, right? So that black dot indicates that if Joe Biden wins that black dot plus all of the states ahead of it, on top of it, then we get a Biden victory. And so in order for Donald Trump to win, he would have to win all those states in which he currently has an advantage, plus some of those states in which Joe Biden currently has an advantage, all the way up to Pennsylvania. So you say, all right, well, let's compare that to 2016. So here are the 2016 results. So that flipping point state there was a lot closer to the zero line in that election. And I'm noticing that when I updated the charts yesterday, they got a little bit off, right? So they were wrong in 3 states. So again, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, they were off in. So I think the flipping point state actually in 2016 is supposed to be New Hampshire, which is the small dot below the black dot. And then those 3 states above it were the ones that Hillary Clinton was supposed to win, but didn't. And then if we go back to 2012, we were off in 2 states. So I think that's, I can't remember who the two states we were off. 2008, they were only off in 1 state. And then 2004, they were off again only in 1 state. So that's what the deep dive into polls suggest. So the second thing that you might say if you want to believe that Trump is going to lose is that right now Joe Biden has a lot of money. There's no doubt that Joe Biden has raised more money. In fact, it's led to big headlines like this: Democrats crushing Republicans in fundraising. But over time, Hillary Clinton had more money than Donald Trump. And today, Donald Trump is living in the White House. If we look at July and who is giving more donors per state, we see that Donald Trump was dominating. But by September, that map shifts pretty fundamentally, such that when we look at cash at hand at the beginning of this month, Joe Biden had $177 million to spend, which is more than double what Donald Trump could spend. And the way that manifests itself is in ad buys. So if we look at some of those really hotly contested states where the blue circle is bigger and it's bigger throughout most of the map, that means that Joe Biden is spending more money on TV than Donald Trump. Right in Georgia, it looks like Donald Trump is spending more than Joe Biden. Here's the Milwaukee market, which is so critical to the Democrats' victory in Wisconsin. From the beginning of the cycle on the left, July 1st, all the way until October 15th. And we see that at this point, Joe Biden is just flooding the airwaves in Milwaukee. The third thing that you might look at are the early voting numbers. Indeed, early voting has been up massive throughout the entire country. In fact, we think that now more than 1/3 of the people who are going to vote, and by the time we're done with early voting, we think that it's going to be up. It could be as high as 2/3 of the vote has already been cataloged. Before we put too much faith or confidence in early voting, though, what we're not sure of is that it balkanizes election day voting. So it could be that all those people that were otherwise going to vote on election day are voting early. Turns out your vote counts the same, no matter when you vote. And so by locking in your vote early, it doesn't mean that it weights more. It just means that you locked it in earlier. So we're not sure if all of this early voting enthusiasm is going to play out in leaning the direction in one way or the other. And the same is true with mail-in ballots. We know that Democrats were twice as likely to ask for a mail-in ballot, and we know that they're returning them at a greater rate. Again, there's a little bit of danger in putting too much faith in mail-in ballots. We know that mail-in ballots are less likely to be counted because the person that filled them out incorrectly. So we think that there's an error rate of between 5 and 10%. That's small, but it's not nothing. And so some of that advantage that would appear to be helping the Democrats in mail-in ballot might not actually bear out. The fourth one, and I suspect that this is the reason that would hurt Donald Trump the most, is at this point there's more interest in Joe Biden than there is Donald Trump. We see that a little bit in the engagement from Twitter, of all things, right? This is supposed to be the president's platform. And per tweet, Joe Biden's is getting much more engagement from the Twitter universe. And we saw that Joe Biden had more viewers at his town hall than Donald Trump did. So that's the narrative, if you want to believe that Donald Trump is really going to lose. Now let's look and say, is Donald Trump really going to lose? No, he's not going to lose. And the first thing that Donald Trump supporters will point to is think about the 2016 election. I would remind you, 2016 was volatile. This is what has happened with polling over the course of the campaign in 2020. This is the volatility of 2016, right? With every scandal, with every gaffe made by Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, with every letter that Comey released, with every debate, there was great fluctuation in the polls. In 2020, there just is almost no fluctuation in the polls. So, right, I'm not sure how relevant 2016 is. It's not the same campaign. The second thing they'll point to is registration numbers. And indeed, the registration numbers show a big Republican advantage. So today in North Carolina, there are about 3% more Republicans, registered Republicans in the state, than there was in 2016. And there are about 6% fewer Democratic registration than there was in 2016. In Pennsylvania, similar numbers, right? Florida, increases in both parties, but a higher increase among Republicans. And then Arizona, you see the big Democratic advantage. So registration numbers, they're meaningful. We can't discount them too much. What we know about Florida and North Carolina is they've had a whole set of voters who've called themselves Democrats for years. And what we think is happening is that some of those people are disaffiliating with the Democratic Party and signing up to the Republican Party, right? Registrants don't necessarily always vote for the party that they're registered to. And we think that some of that slippage from 2016 and the Democrats who voted for Donald Trump has now reclassified itself as Republicans. But we're not sure. The third thing that Trump voters will point to is the enthusiasm gap. Donald Trump is still going around the country having rallies like this, 4 or 5 a day, with thousands of people. And if Joe Biden is doing rallies, they look a little bit more like this, maybe a couple hundred folks. And the enthusiasm gap is real. So if we look at polling numbers, Donald Trump voters are more enthusiastic. Again, right, enthusiasm is a little bit like voting early. Like an enthusiastic voter still counts as one, as does a not at all enthusiastic. That vote still counts as one. But if it's raining and you really don't want to vote, an enthusiastic voter is more likely to show up on the day of the election than a non-enthusiastic. The point that I would suggest to you that might undercut this a bit is that is the unfavorability of rating of Donald Trump. So if we go back to 1956, Democrats and Republicans, right? So Adlai Stevenson was strongly unfavorable, according to 16% of the American public. Eisenhower was only 4% strongly unfavorable. Over time, we see numbers in the 15, 20s. 2016 was highly unusual, and that both candidates were really viewed unfavorably by the American public, strongly unfavorably. But we don't have a repeat of that, at least with Joe Biden in 2020. So his unfavorability is very much in line with where Obama's and John Kerry and some of those before, right? Not nearly as high as it was with Hillary Clinton. And Donald Trump's strongly unfavorable has come down a bit to 46%. The fourth reason that people will say that Trump isn't going to lose this election is because of the quiet Trump voters. And of course, the entire theory about there being quiet Trump voters is predicated on the fact that pollsters can't get at them. So I can't present to you any data. The one thing that I might suggest to you is I've yet to meet someone who is a Donald Trump supporter who hasn't been really excited to tell me what a huge Donald Trump supporter they were. But those are the two narratives. That's, I think, the best case for why you think that Donald Trump really could lose this election, or why there's no chance that he's going to lose the election. And with that, I'm open to any questions that you might have about anything that I presented this afternoon.
We'll start with, what are your thoughts on the Texas House and what that means for redistricting?
Right, so the Texas House is so critical for redistricting. What we know, right, we talked a whole lot about Austin suburbs and being in some of those competitive U.S. House races. That's because the Republicans who gerrymandered the state after the 2010 census created lots of districts that were going to be really hard for Democrats to win, unless if there's big changes in American politics. Turns out there's pretty big changes in American politics. So some of those races that they thought were going to be safe for the Republicans are now tilting towards the Democratic direction. So the Texas House is so critical is because it would give the Democratic Party a seat at the table when it's redistricting. So it means there would have to be some compromises made. There would have to be a map that would look more equitable. Now whether or not we think that the Texas House is going to flip, I think that's hard. I mean, I think if Joe Biden ends up winning the state, I could imagine the Texas House flipping, but I can't imagine anything short of that the Texas House would ever flip. I suspect the Democrats might gain 2 or 3 seats, but I think they need up at 9 seats. That's a whole lot, especially given how well they did in the 2018 election.
Thank you. Next question. Do you think the experience of 4 years of Trump in the White House is an argument for the yes or no faction?
It's an argument for both, right? So the people in the yes, right, that Trump was really going to lose, they're going to say, look at all the things that he's done. How could he not lose this election? And the people in the no column are going to be like, look at all the things that he's done. There's no way he's going to lose this election. What we know about Donald Trump is that he's really polarized American politics. I think to the disadvantage of the president, the people who the disproportionate way in which his supporters have been smaller in numbers than his opponents. But the margins are small enough that we're still going to play the game, right? The odds makers in Las Vegas might tell us that there's no way that a certain team is going to win a Super Bowl, but yet they still play the Super Bowl. So it doesn't matter what all the pollsters think. It doesn't matter what all the experts think. We're still going to play the game. People are going to vote. And sometimes fluky things happen. 2016.
Right. Where are you going to watch the results come in? Do you have any election day traditions?
Oh, I do have election day traditions. And my tradition has always been to watch the results come in with all my students, right? I'm teaching these big classes, and there's nothing I like more to order a bunch of pizzas, and we watch all the returns come in. We'll have 2 different channels up on the big screens, and we watch the returns come in, and I'll try to give some insight. But of course, we're living in a COVID world. So the idea of being packed in a big room with 300 of my students watching the returns come in isn't going to happen. So at this point, I'm going to have a quiet little dinner at home with a friend, and we're going to watch the results and see what happens.
Great. This next question is a long one. Is there some source that anybody can reference throughout the year that provides information on what the senators or representatives actually accomplish? Political ads distort facts about the opponent, so how do the voters know what's fact or fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, there is no really easy source. One of I'm going to point you to 3 different directions. So the first direction is called Politico, which is all eyes on politics. They produce a daily edition called The Huddle, which is all about congressional politics. And so what they'll tell you is what's going on, what the bills are being voted on. For people that want hardcore facts, this might not be your source, because sometimes it'll drift over into soap opera land, like who's fighting with whom and stuff like that. So if you want more cold, hard facts, then I think the source is Congressional Quarterly. So they produce a weekly magazine. And there they do a deep dive. It's strictly nonpartisan. They'll tell you what bills are going through a committee, what bills are being debated on the floor of the House or the Senate, the prospects for them, what the other chamber's likely to do. I think it's the best source of information, unbiased information on Congress. And then halfway in between Politico, The Huddle, and Congressional Quarterly is Roll Call, right? This is the newspaper of Capitol Hill. And so they give you a newspaper perspective on what's happening. And sometimes it's soap opera-ish. Sometimes it's pretty policy-based. But I think it's, again, an unbiased source. And the nice thing about Roll Call and The Huddle is that they're free. So if you just log on, you can see the stories. CQ requires a subscription.
Thank you. Very helpful. This question is from one of your former students. Do you think the Electoral College will ever be abolished?
No, I don't think it will be. Right, and if Bethany were here, your speaker from last week, she and I would have a debate about whether or not we think it should be abolished. And I think we both play a little bit devil's advocate, right? The reason I don't think it's ever going to be abolished is because it advantages certain states. It advantages small states. So Montana has 3 Electoral College votes instead of just 1. Wyoming has 3 Electoral College votes instead of just 1. So in order to get rid of the Electoral College, not only would it require an act of Congress, but then it would have to be approved by 3/4 of the states. there's no way you can get 3/4 of those small states to sign on. And so, right, California's voters are always going to have a lower share than they should in the Electoral College. And Texans are going to have a lower share than they have in the Electoral College. So unfortunately, unless if we do a whole scrap of the Constitution, I think it's highly unlikely.
How, if at all, does the VP nominee affect the predictions?
So, right, so Joe Biden is going to win California. I think that Joe Biden was going to win California before Kamala Harris was named to the ticket. Donald Trump is going to win Indiana. So, right, like geographically, I'm not sure how much of a role it's going to have. What we know is that over the course of the campaign, there have been 3 or 4 days in which Joe Biden has raised a whole lot of money. And one of those days was the day that he named Kamala Harris to the ticket. And so the way that we can think about that is that when he named Kamala Harris to the ticket, it drove up the enthusiasm of some of those people that might have been sitting on the sidelines and made them not only enthusiastic voters for the ticket, but so enthusiastic that they're willing to open their pocketbooks for them. And so it may have played helpful in that sense. I'm not sure how different that would have been if the nominee were Karen Bass or Susan Rice or some of the other names that were bandied about. But there's no doubt that Kamala Harris provided that punch. Right, and right, Mike Pence at this point is just part of the Trump administration. Like, so I think there could have been some play back in the 2016 election. I think that Mike Pence probably shored up that evangelical base that Donald Trump was having difficulty with. Would the list of potential Supreme Court nominees have done that on its own? Perhaps. But certainly naming Mike Pence to the ticket mattered. So when we think about the naming of the VP, we think of it accomplishing some sort of balance. So traditionally, it's always been geographic balance. I don't think that's at play at all in this election. But for Joe Biden, right, Kamala Harris is a woman of color and younger. And so, right, balance was achieved in different sorts of ways. Mike Pence certainly has a different association with his faith, shall we say, than Donald Trump does. And so maybe in 2016 that played out, and maybe in 2020 it's playing out in the exact same way. But we can't point to much evidence that it made a decisive impact in the race unless we go all the way back to 1964, right, when Lyndon Johnson was named to the ticket. And we think with that, John Kennedy picked up Texas, and with that, right, he picked up some of the South, and with that, he won the presidency.
Thank you. Do you expect that we will have a reliable result on November 4th?
Will we have November 4th? So I think that we will have paths made clearer. Whether or not we will have gotten to that critical 270th Electoral College vote that the news organizations are declaring a winner, I'm not sure that we're going to be there. But what's going to be clear, I would think, by November 4th, the day after the election, is we'll know the results in Florida, Texas, and Arizona. And I think with those 3 results, we'll know a whole lot. And the reason that we'll know is because in each of those states right now, they're counting the early voting. They're counting the mail-in voting. And so when we add that to the election day voting, we'll know what's going to happen in those 3 states by 11, 12 o'clock, maybe 1 o'clock. Now, if Donald Trump wins those 3 states, right, there's still a pretty clear path for Joe Biden. If Donald Trump loses one of those 3 states, the path becomes really difficult for the Republicans. So it depends what happens in those 3 states and how clearly they speak on election night. Because what we know is that Pennsylvania, I keep repeating these states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they don't start counting their mail-in ballots until the day of the election, which means 4 days after the election, they're still counting them. Perhaps 6 days after the election, they're still counting them. And if those states are critical for either candidate getting above 270, then we're all going to be waiting with bated breath. But if at that point, Joe Biden has already won Florida or already won Arizona or already won North Carolina, then that path becomes so difficult for Donald Trump. So I think that we'll have a good indication of where we think the race is heading, but I don't think that we'll have a declared winner by then.
Thank you. We have so many questions, but I think we'll just take 2 more if you don't mind. For the people who reply no opinion to the polls, is the thinking that they truly have no opinion, or is that a tactic of people who don't feel comfortable admitting who they support?
Yeah, and there have been deep dives by people far smarter than me that have tried to find the silent Trump voter in the polls leading into the 2016 election that can account for the results in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The best analysis that I read has suggested that we just didn't have enough polls in those states close enough till election day to know what was actually happening in those states. I find that argument much more persuasive than I do that there was this silent majority that ended up breaking for Donald Trump. Because what we know about some of the polls that were done in those states is that those that strongly disapproved of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump ended up disproportionately voting for Donald Trump. But we knew those in the polls. We just didn't think that there was as many of them maybe as there were, or that the overall margins were as close as they were. And what we know in the 2020 cycle is we have far more polls in each of those states, and we have far more polling organizations. And so unless if they're all fooling themselves, or unless if they're all calling the same set of voters, and we know that right, they're in business not to follow each other, right? They're the ones that want to be different, because by being different, you can have a clear name for yourself. But they're all showing us a pretty similar trend. And so I'm not sure if they're breaking quite that same way. The last thing I would say about that point too is we know that of those who strongly disapprove of the president and Joe Biden today, we know that they're more likely to vote for Joe Biden. And so again, I find that suspicious. I think that there are better explanations for what happened in 2016 than that. But again, that's the reason we play the game.
Great, thank you. Okay, last question. Let's see, do the data suggest the increase in gender and age gaps is something we can expect to continue seeing in future elections?
I don't know if the data would project out that far. I think a lot of those data, and I see this co-teaching with Bethany and all the students that we get to talk to in our big class, is that part of a lot of that's driving that is just Donald Trump. Right? There are a lot of Republican suburban women that just can't get on the Trump train after 4 years. There's a lot of my younger students who just can't get to any support of Donald Trump, where you could imagine a different Republican candidate, right? Like imagine for a moment Marco Rubio. We could imagine him having a much different appeal. And so I don't want to read too much into these growing trends and what that portends for 2022 or 2024. But I feel pretty confident that trend is going to persist for at least the next week. And then we'll see where we are after the next election.
Sounds good. On behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development and Public Affairs teams, we want to thank Dr. Theriault and attendees as well for sharing your valuable time with us.